The night Adrian Vale realized money could destroy lives more quietly than bullets was the same night he watched his father's signature turn into a weapon on a glass conference table, the ink still wet, the room still warm with applause, while outside the city lights flickered like they already knew someone had just been sentenced without a trial. And before we go any further, let me ask you something honestly because it matters for this story. Where are you watching this video from right now, and what time is it there? Night or day? Because the choices people make in the dark often look very different in the light. And Adrian did not know it yet, but that single question would one day haunt him more than any scream ever could. He was 27, freshly promoted, and standing at the edge of a financial empire built by his father Victor Vale, a man praised in magazines as disciplined, visionary, and untouchable. But Adrian saw something else that night. He saw fear dressed as confidence, numbers hiding bodies, and contracts hiding graves. It all began with a deal that saved the company billions, a restructuring that quietly transferred losses onto shell firms that employed thousands of people who would wake up weeks later to empty accounts and eviction notices. While Victor raised a toast to efficiency and progress, Adrian smiled too, because that is what sons of powerful men are trained to do: smile, nod, and inherit silence. But when the meeting ended and the room emptied, Adrian noticed one file left behind, thin, unmarked, almost careless, and curiosity pulled him toward it with the force of gravity. Inside were names, not numbers, names highlighted in red, followed by brief notes like non-essential, liquidated, written off, and one phrase repeated again and again: acceptable loss. Adrian felt his stomach tighten because he recognized one name: Elias Moore, a quiet man who used to sit across from him every morning at the same coffee shop, who once mentioned his pension was tied to a subsidiary Adrian had just seen, erased on paper. That night Adrian did not sleep. He stared at the ceiling, replaying his father's voice, echoing words like necessary and strategic. And by morning he convinced himself this was how the world worked, that power always crushed someone underneath. And if you did not want to be crushed, you learned to stand higher. Weeks passed, bonuses came, headlines praised Victor Vale again, and then the calls started, first from Elias, then from others, people Adrian barely knew but whose lives intersected with his in ways he could not ignore. Some asked for help, some begged, some just wanted answers, and Adrian did nothing, not because he was cruel but because he was afraid of challenging a system that had fed him everything he had ever known, until the day Elias did not call again. Instead, the news reported a suicide, financial stress cited as cause. Adrian attended the funeral quietly, standing at the back, watching a family collapse into each other like a building whose supports had been cut, and something inside him cracked, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. Guilt settled into him like a slow infection, and for the first time Adrian wondered how many lives were buried beneath the balance sheets that bore his last name. He confronted his father that evening, carefully, choosing words like a lawyer, not a son. Victor listened patiently, poured a drink, and said something that changed Adrian forever. He said, "Morality is a luxury for people without responsibility. Power demands sacrifice, and history only remembers winners." Adrian realized then that Victor did not see victims, he saw costs, and costs were meant to be minimized, not mourned. That night Adrian made a decision he did not fully understand yet. He decided to learn everything, not to expose his father, not to fight him openly, but to understand the machinery well enough to one day reverse its direction. He began, staying late, reading contracts line by line, tracing money through offshore accounts, learning how influence moved faster than cash. He discovered how regulators were softened with future positions, how media narratives were purchased through advertising budgets, how politicians learned silence through donations that never appeared in public records. Adrian became invisible by design, the quiet executive who asked smart questions and never challenged authority. Victor trusted him more each month, sharing deeper secrets, bigger strategies, while unknowingly sharpening the knife that would one day be turned inward. But revenge was not a fire for Adrian. It was ice, slow, patient, and precise. He did not want his father arrested or publicly ruined. That would be too simple, too loud, and it would turn Victor into a martyr of ambition. Adrian wanted something else. He wanted Victor to understand loss, to feel power slipping away without knowing where it went, to watch his empire decay while he stood helpless inside it. And so Adrian began planting seeds, subtle adjustments in risk models, recommendations that appeared conservative but quietly shifted exposure, partnerships that tied Victor Vale holdings to entities Adrian secretly controlled, through layers of intermediaries. Nothing illegal, nothing obvious, just enough to make the empire dependent on structures only Adrian fully understood. Years passed, and Victor aged. His confidence hardened into routine. He stopped questioning success, stopped looking closely at the numbers, trusting the son he believed was molded perfectly in his image. And then the market shifted, not crashed, just shifted, like a tide pulling unnoticed at first, Profits dipped, then stalled. Victor responded as he always had, cutting costs, selling off divisions, marking more names as acceptable losses, and each decision fed directly into Adrian's design, strengthening the trap while convincing Victor he was still in control. The first real crack came when a major acquisition collapsed overnight. Due to a regulatory obstacle Victor had been assured would never exist, investors panicked, the stock slid, and Victor looked to Adrian for answers. Adrian provided them calmly, presenting solutions that required transferring authority, consolidating decision-making, all temporary of course, all reasonable under crisis, Victor agreed, because power always trusts familiarity more than caution, and Adrian stepped closer to the center of the machine, not as an avenger, but as a steward, at least on paper. Yet every night Adrian dreamed of Elias, of red highlighted names, of families folding into themselves, and he reminded himself why patience mattered, because revenge rushed is revenge wasted. And what was coming needed time to grow roots deep enough that even Victor Vale could not pull them out once they wrapped around his empire. The illusion of control is strongest just before it collapses. And Adrian understood this as he watched his father walk into meetings with the calm arrogance of a man who believed the ground beneath him was solid, unaware that every step pressed deeper into a structure designed to give way. Because the next phase was never about destruction but dependency. And Adrian spent months refining it with the precision of a surgeon who knows exactly when to cut and when to wait. He positioned himself as the only executive who could interpret the increasingly complex financial architecture he had helped design, speaking in careful language that reassured investors while quietly alarming board members just enough to make them lean on him for clarity. And Victor encouraged it, proud of the son who seemed to stabilize storms that would have sunk lesser leaders. But what Victor did not see was how Adrian was reshaping loyalty inside the company, offering quiet promotions to analysts overlooked for years, protecting mid-level managers from sudden layoffs, and creating a private network of people who trusted him not because he paid them more but because he listened when no one else did. Trust became his real currency, far more valuable than stock or leverage. And when the next market fluctuation arrived, Adrian was ready. He advised caution while Victor demanded aggression. But this time the board sided with Adrian, citing risk exposure models that Adrian himself had written months earlier, models that now painted Victor's old strategies as reckless. Victor felt the shift before he could name it. Conversations grew shorter, approvals slower, and for the first time in decades his word was no longer the final one in the room. Irritation replaced certainty, and he pushed harder, ordering asset sales that Adrian warned against, which triggered penalties embedded deep in contracts Victor had never bothered to read because he had trusted Adrian to handle the details. Each penalty drained liquidity just enough to force the company into emergency financing. Financing that came from institutions quietly linked to Adrian through layered investment vehicles. Nothing traceable on the surface. Everything legal. Everything devastating. Victor began spending late nights alone in his office again, staring at screens like they might blink first. And Adrian recognized the posture. It was the same one he had seen at Elia's funeral. The posture of someone realizing the future had already been decided somewhere else. Guilt resurfaced, but Adrian did not retreat, because this was no longer only about his father. It was about every life reduced to a line item, every sacrifice justified by distance. And Adrian needed Victor to understand that distance offered no protection when consequences arrived. The press began circling, not attacking, just questioning, small articles asking why returns were flattening, why long-trusted strategies were underperforming. Victor blamed market sentiment, then regulators, then internal incompetence, never once considering that the machine itself had turned against him. Meanwhile, Adrian initiated something far quieter and far more damaging. He began restoring what had been erased, using foundation grants, quiet buyouts, and strategic rehiring to bring back fragments of the lives his father had destroyed. Not publicly, not heroically, but deliberately. He ensured that severance packages were expanded, pensions partially reinstated through complex mergers, and families once written off as acceptable losses found stability again without ever knowing who had intervened. Adrian did not want gratitude, he wanted balance, and every restored life strengthened his resolve, because it proved that power could also heal if guided differently. Victor noticed the cash bleed and demanded explanations. Adrian provided spreadsheets so dense they discouraged scrutiny. And Victor signed without reading, trusting the son who had become his shield against collapse. The irony was almost unbearable, but Adrian stayed focused, because the final step required absolute confidence from Victor, and that confidence arrived when a crisis hit harder than expected. A global shock that froze credit lines overnight, companies scrambled, markets dipped sharply, and Victor panicked openly for the first time. He called Adrian at dawn, voice strained, asking what to do. And Adrian answered calmly, presenting a solution that required transferring controlling interest of key holdings into a newly structured trust to protect assets from volatility, a temporary safeguard, Adrian said, something that would stabilize operations until conditions normalized. Victor hesitated, instincts flickering weakly, but fear drowned them out, and he signed. The moment the ink dried, Adrian felt the weight of years lift slightly. Because the trap was now complete, Victor Vale no longer controlled the empire he believed was his. Not legally, not operationally, not strategically, he still wore the title, still sat at the head of the table, but decisions now flowed around him like water around a stone. Weeks passed, then months, and Victor aged visibly. The man once praised for dominance, now reduced to reacting rather than commanding. His voice lost its edge. His orders required approval, and the board listened politely before turning to Adrian for confirmation, which he always gave respectfully, never humiliating, never overt, because humiliation would cheapen the lesson. The real blow came when Victor attempted one last aggressive move, a massive restructuring designed to restore control, only to discover that the clauses he needed authority over had been reassigned under the trust he himself had approved. His signature had sealed his own silence. Rage followed disbelief, then denial. Victor accused advisors, lawyers, analysts, anyone but Adrian, and Adrian absorbed it all quietly, because revenge was not in the accusations, it was in the realization that none of it mattered anymore. Victor Vale had built an empire that functioned perfectly without him, exactly as he had taught it to. Adrian visited Elias' grave one evening after work, standing alone under fading light, and he did not apologize because apologies changed nothing. Instead, he promised that the machine that crushed him would never be allowed to operate the same way again, and as Adrian walked back to his car, he received a call from his father, not angry this time, just tired, asking a question that cut deeper than any accusation, asking when control had slipped away. Adrian answered honestly, saying it slipped away the moment you stopped seeing people and only saw numbers. Silence followed, long and heavy, and Adrian knew the end was approaching, not with explosions or arrests, but with understanding, which was far more painful for someone like Victor. The empire would survive, refined, corrected, stripped of its cruelty, and Victor would live long enough to watch it prosper without his command, which was the only punishment that truly fit the crime. The transformation of Victor Vale from untouchable titan to a man shackled by his own empire was not immediate. It unfolded like a slow storm that leaves devastation long before the sky clears, and Adrian understood every movement needed perfect timing, because one misstep and the entire plan would collapse into obvious revenge. And revenge in plain sight is weak, it is loud, it is fleeting. What Adrian sought was subtlety, permanence, a retribution so clean that it could be mistaken for fate itself. And so he began the next phase with meticulous patience, first by observing Victor's habits, noting the slight tremor in his hand when reviewing volatile investments, the impatience when answering boardroom questions he no longer fully understood, the arrogance fading into caution that could be exploited. And while Victor believed he was teaching Adrian discipline and strategy, Adrian was teaching himself the art of invisible domination. Every conversation, every recommendation, every reassuring nod became part of a larger architecture, a lattice of influence designed to trap rather than liberate, and to outsiders the company appeared steady, even flourishing, profits within acceptable range, expansion projects moving, employees confident, headlines praising Victor Vale as the resilient leader who survived a global financial upheaval. But beneath the polished reports, Adrian had embedded tiny pressures, microtransactions that seemed negligible, contractual adjustments that passed legal review but rerouted authority into entities he controlled. Nothing could be traced back to him. Yet the cumulative effect shifted power imperceptibly, like a river eroding a cliff face over years until one day, the landscape is unrecognizable. Adrian's network quietly grew. People who owed loyalty not to Victor or not to the company, but to Adrian's vision of fairness. People who understood the cost of unchecked ambition and the fragility of trust. He empowered whistleblowers discreetly, corrected financial mismanagement silently, and planted seeds of stability where Victor had sown instability. Because Adrian knew true revenge was not merely to hurt, but to balance, to restore justice in a way that leaves the guilty conscious of their mistakes, without ever suspecting the architect. The night he first realized the full scale of his design, he walked alone through the executive floor, empty, lights dim, monitors glowing, and imagined Victor walking in at any moment, looking around and wondering why decisions no longer bent to his will. And Adrian allowed himself a small smile, not for cruelty but for inevitability, like a chess player seeing the endgame emerge in slow motion. The following weeks intensified his control. Victor made a critical error, approving a risky foreign investment without consulting Adrian, and the exposure triggered regulatory reviews that Adrian had prearranged through subtle guidance to allies within compliance departments. Victor panicked, demanded explanations, and Adrian offered carefully constructed analyses, emphasizing stability and risk management. Victor nodded, satisfied temporarily. Unaware that the oversight had already caused ripple effects Adrian could manipulate to consolidate his influence further. Every department began reporting through Adrian's channels. Every major decision required his input, and Victor's confidence eroded silently, replaced by a dependence he could not recognize. Meanwhile, Adrian continued his personal campaign of restoration. Families destroyed by the Veil Empire were quietly compensated, careers rebuilt, pensions reinstated under complex but legal structures that shielded their origin. He did not seek recognition or gratitude. He sought the moral satisfaction of creating balance, each act feeding his resolve, but he never allowed sentiment to cloud strategy. Because revenge is only effective when it is emotionless and precise. Months turned into a year, and the cumulative effect of Adrian's interventions left Victor's empire technically intact but functionally bound to Adrian's control. The board noticed the shift, raising questions that Adrian answered calmly, deflecting suspicion while reinforcing dependency. Victor grew increasingly frustrated, yelling at analysts, blaming market instability, but the company performed within acceptable limits, stability masking the reality that his authority was now conditional. The first true test came when Victor attempted to reverse a decision Adrian had guided months earlier, transferring a critical asset to a subsidiary controlled by Adrian. Victor's signature authorized the move, and when the documents returned to the office the next morning, compliance confirmed legality, executives approved, and Victor was powerless to alter the outcome. The irony was exquisite. He had orchestrated the very trap he now found himself in. Adrian observed the moment quietly, not gloating, not mocking, simply witnessing the consequence of arrogance, and he knew the lesson would last longer this way, teaching Victor that control is not inherited, it is earned daily, and misused power can be stripped without violence. The empire continued under this delicate balance for another year, Adrian maintaining the appearance of support, providing solutions, mitigating crises, while Victor floundered, unaware that every move he made had been anticipated, every decision manipulated, and every signature prearranged to reinforce dependency. The media continued to praise him publicly, but privately executives whispered about the son's subtle influence, about how financial strategies had shifted, how the company weathered storms with unnatural consistency, and Victor grew suspicious of patterns he could not name. His instincts screamed that something was wrong, but he could not locate the cause, and that uncertainty gnawed at his confidence more effectively than any public scandal ever could. Adrian intensified the final stage, establishing partnerships that required Victor's approval on paper but placed operational control in Adrian's hands, simultaneously creating channels for compensation to those victims once erased, carefully balancing restoration with authority, so that Victor could never trace back the cause. Every legal contract, every board resolution, every regulatory filing was a thread in an intricate web, and each thread tightened the noose imperceptibly. The psychological toll on Victor mounted. Sleepless nights, subtle tremors in speech. The once confident Titan now hesitated to sign checks, to call meetings, to assert dominance. And Adrian knew the moment of reckoning was approaching. It would not be dramatic. It would not involve confrontation. It would be the quiet realization that the man who once commanded loyalty, fear, and obedience now depended on the son he had trained to follow. The empire survived, as Victor had always prided himself, but the heart of it had shifted. Authority and influence consolidated into hands he could not see. And Adrian finally understood the paradox of revenge. It is sweetest not when it crushes, but when it teaches, when it leaves the perpetrator alive to witness the consequences of their choices. And so he allowed Victor to call another emergency meeting, another risky investment, another signature on a contract, each step reinforcing the structure Adrian had built, the board, the executives, the regulatory channels, all dancing to a rhythm that only Adrian conducted. While Victor remained oblivious, pride still intact on the surface but hollow underneath, Adrian continued to restore what had been destroyed, reinforcing his moral authority silently. And every time he visited the office at night, he walked past photographs of Victor receiving awards, shaking hands, smiling at public events, and he imagined the man behind the mask, alone, frustrated, powerless. Finally learning the lesson Adrian had taken years to perfect, the lesson that wealth and influence are meaningless without responsibility, that people are not numbers, and that cruelty, no matter how expertly disguised in strategy, eventually encounters consequence. And this understanding was the culmination of everything Adrian had orchestrated, a perfect equilibrium of justice, power, and subtle revenge, one that required no explosions, no arrests, no scandal, only patience, precision, and a meticulous understanding of human ambition. As months turned into years, Victor aged, his confidence continued to wane, and he became increasingly reliant on the very son he had raised to admire him. Every decision filtered, every approval checked, and every triumph subtly controlled. The empire thrived as designed, the victims quietly restored, the guilty confronted with impotence, and Adrian finally allowed himself to feel the satisfaction of completion. The lesson he had labored to deliver embedded invisibly in every corner of the empire, permanent, undeniable, and mercilessly effective. The quiet dominance Adrian had woven into every corner of the Vale Empire reached its zenith in ways Victor could not anticipate, because true control is not taken by force, it is claimed through invisibility. And Adrian had become invisible to everyone except those who needed his guidance, those whose loyalty could be quietly directed, those whose lives he had silently restored in exchange for trust. And now Victor faced the ultimate irony. The man who had built an empire on fear and obedience had trained the one person who could dismantle it without ever raising his voice, and as the financial quarter approached its close, the market prepared for volatility, investors whispered rumors, analysts questioned strategy, and Victor panicked, calling urgent meetings that Adrian orchestrated so carefully. Each document he signed reinforced dependency. Each directive he issued served Adrian's purpose. Each decision added another layer of subtle control. He felt the frustration mounting, his voice lost its authoritative timbre, hesitation replaced certainty, and the staff, the board, even outside consultants began consulting Adrian first, always, because his calm presence made chaos appear manageable. And Victor felt powerless, trapped inside an empire that on paper was still his, yet in every functional way had become a machine he could no longer navigate. One evening Adrian invited Victor to review the portfolio of subsidiaries, a casual suggestion, yet carefully planned, and, as Victor scanned the documents, he noticed unusual reporting structures, shifts he could not remember authorizing, dependencies that seemed natural but were unfamiliar. He looked to Adrian for explanation, and Adrian provided a careful, precise walkthrough, calm and patient, showing stability and risk management, while knowing the deeper truth was invisible to Victor. Every subsidiary, every asset, every contract was now part of a network controlled by Adrian, legally untouchable, perfectly orchestrated, the ultimate proof of silent revenge. Victor left the room bewildered, questioning himself, and Adrian did not celebrate or taunt, because revenge is strongest when unseen, and he understood that Victor's suffering was not in confrontation but in quiet helplessness. The gradual realization that every move he made was anticipated, every decision influenced, every risk managed without his understanding, and as months progressed, Victor grew increasingly cautious, second-guessing himself, his confidence eroded by patterns he could not name, while Adrian continued restoration projects, ensuring families destroyed under Victor's tenure regained stability, silently paying off debts, reinstating pensions, reviving livelihoods, and in doing so reinforced his moral authority. The contrast between Victor's impotence and Adrian's discrete power became undeniable. The employees who once feared Victor now respected Adrian, the analysts who once obeyed out of necessity now followed out of trust. The entire ecosystem shifted imperceptibly, subtly, permanently, and Victor began to notice the difference, asking questions, reading reports, trying to regain comprehension, yet every pathway led back to Adrian, every solution relied on him, every emergency handled by him. And still Victor could not see the architecture of control, the web woven invisibly over years. He felt the weight of authority slip through his fingers like water, and the frustration became almost physical. The tension in his shoulders, the fatigue in his eyes, the growing awareness that his empire, once a fortress of unquestionable power, had become a cage, his own decisions now feeding a machine he no longer fully understood. Adrian observed silently, studying Victor's behavior like a strategist reviewing a battlefield, and the culmination of his work approached, for he had one final stage to enact, a masterstroke that would leave Victor fully aware of the shift, yet without the devastation of public scandal. The moment had been meticulously prepared: contracts, subsidiaries, trust structures, executive appointments, regulatory alignments all converged at once, creating a scenario where Victor's final approval of a critical merger would transfer operational authority entirely to Adrian's controlled entities. On the surface a strategic move, beneath the surface a permanent shift in power. Victor, unaware of the magnitude, signed the documents with the confidence of a man who had always been in control. And in that moment Adrian saw the perfect alignment, the culmination of patience, calculation, and moral clarity, a system of silent justice that ensured Victor would live to witness the consequences, to feel helpless within the very empire he had built, but without destruction, without scandal, only the slow dawning of understanding. And that night Adrian walked the executive floor, empty, illuminated by the glow of monitors, imagining Victor pacing through the same corridors, grasping at a reality that had subtly slipped through his fingers, and he understood fully that the greatest revenge is the one that teaches, that allows the perpetrator to comprehend the results of their choices, to feel the weight of power misused, and to confront the inevitability of their own failure. Because Adrian had not sought to humiliate, he had sought to correct, to balance, to restore what had been destroyed while teaching the man who believed himself untouchable that power carries consequences. Victor called Adrian the following morning, voice low, restrained, asking how such a seamless transition of control had occurred. Adrian answered honestly yet carefully, explaining the rationale as strategic, emphasizing stability, risk management, and continuity, leaving Victor with the bitter clarity that his empire now functioned independently of his command, that his decisions mattered less than he ever realized, and that every ethical lapse, every family destroyed, every life treated as collateral, had finally returned to him as a lesson, devastating precisely because it required no public humiliation, no court ruling, numagia circus, only comprehension. The ultimate proof of invisible authority. In the following months, Adrian continued refinement, subtly restructuring investments, strengthening the infrastructure he controlled, while continuing to restore families affected by previous financial manipulation. Silently ensuring that justice was served without fanfare, the employees now revered him quietly, knowing only that stability had returned, trust had been reinstated, and profits remained strong. Victor watched it all, powerless to intervene, a man surrounded by evidence of his own impotence, learning finally that the brilliance he had admired in himself could be dismantled with patience, precision, and moral clarity. And in the quiet evenings when the city lights flickered like distant memories, Adrian reflected on the journey, understanding the paradox of revenge, that the most effective retribution is invisible, long-lasting, restorative, and mercilessly precise. He had learned the art of patience, the power of subtlety, and the moral imperative to balance destruction with restoration. And in this way, the Vale Empire continued, thriving, evolving, corrected, while Victor Vale himself remained alive to witness the consequences, a living testament to the lesson that unchecked ambition, cruelty, and disregard for human life carry a weight that cannot be outrun, only understood, internalized, and felt in the quiet moments when control slips away without a single shout or public accusation. And as Adrian walked home that night, he passed the memorials of those lost and restored, seeing not his own success, but the invisible web of justice he had spun, knowing that the ultimate revenge had been perfected, not in the ruin of his father, but in the restoration of balance, the reclamation of human dignity, and the slow, undeniable shift of power into hands that wielded it wisely. And in this final alignment of justice and strategy, Adrian understood fully the immense responsibility that came with control, the weight of knowing when to act, when to wait, when to punish, and when to heal. A lesson that Victor Vale would carry for the rest of his life, every day aware of the subtle shift, powerless to alter it, yet living, observing, and finally learning the true cost of a legacy built without conscience. The empire of Victor Vale, once a symbol of unquestionable dominance, had become a mirror reflecting his own mistakes, and Adrian watched it unfold with the patience of someone who had planted a forest, knowing he would never see it fall, yet understanding that every tree mattered in the ecosystem of justice. Victor's mornings began with hesitation, the confident stride replaced by careful pacing. The office staff now instinctively sought Adrian's guidance first, and Victor noticed it. Small shifts at first, a hesitant question from an executive, a subtle reliance on reports prepared by Adrian, and then patterns emerged. Undeniable and inescapable, he was no longer the pivot of the empire. He was a participant in a system designed to function with or without his consent. And that realization gnawed at his pride like a persistent shadow. Adrian never confronted him directly, never revealed his orchestration, because the true power of revenge lies in invisibility, in allowing the guilty to understand their impotence without ever knowing the architect. And as the quarters passed, Victor attempted to regain control through aggressive strategy, pushing for bold investments, restructuring divisions, but each initiative met an invisible barrier, preemptively guided by Adrian's subtle alignments with regulators, analysts, and legal structures. Each risk that seemed manageable to Victor had been manipulated to enforce dependency, while Adrian continued quietly restoring what had been destroyed. Families previously reduced to casualties of corporate strategy were rehabilitated, jobs reinstated, pensions returned, all under layers of legal and financial discretion that left no trace. And this duality, restoration and control, reinforced Adrian's unseen power. Victor grew increasingly tense, his once sharp instincts dulled by uncertainty, his confidence eroded by the subtle awareness that decisions made in good faith no longer carried the weight they once did. And yet, on the surface, the company thrived, profits remained stable, headlines continued to praise the Vale legacy, and investors remained confident, because Adrian had mastered the art of invisible authority, balancing restoration with domination, morality with strategy, all while maintaining the illusion that Victor remained at the helm, The first true emotional blow came when Victor discovered that a critical asset transfer, executed with his own signature months earlier, had given operational control to entities entirely under Adrian's influence. Legally binding, perfectly executed, irreversible without complex legal entanglement. And the realization struck him like cold steel. The empire he had believed was his fortress now operated independently, and the man who had once crushed dissent, who had demanded absolute obedience, who had treated people as collateral, now stood powerless, watching a structure he thought he commanded function flawlessly without his guidance. And Adrian observed silently, noting the tremor in his father's voice, the hesitation in his hand, the growing fatigue that no amount of sleep could erase. Yet he never gloated, because revenge is strongest when unseen, when comprehension alone delivers the lesson. And the final phase involved Victor facing this truth without humiliation, without scandal, only the sober recognition that every unethical choice, every life disregarded, every relationship exploited had consequences that could be orchestrated quietly, precisely, permanently. The empire itself became a vehicle for teaching, the infrastructure of silent justice, and Adrian ensured that every board decision, every financial movement, every regulatory approval reinforced this architecture. Victor's frustration mounted. Attempts to assert authority only highlighted dependency. The board and executives instinctively turned to Adrian for approval or advice. The pattern undeniable, and Victor began to question himself, asking if he had miscalculated, if the empire had shifted subtly under his nose, yet unable to pinpoint the cause, unable to reclaim dominance. Every signature he provided now strengthened the control he no longer held, and in these months, Adrian's moral restoration efforts continued, reinforcing families previously destroyed, investing in rehabilitation, restoring dignity to those erased as acceptable losses, all executed in secrecy, so that the contrast between Victor's impotence and Adrian's silent influence became absolute. One evening, Adrian walked past Victor's office, seeing him alone, papers scattered, head in hands, a man who had once commanded the world now forced to confront his own mistakes. And Adrian understood that the ultimate revenge had been achieved, not through confrontation or scandal, but through the quiet erosion of unearned authority and the simultaneous restoration of what had been destroyed, a dual legacy of correction and control. The board recognized Adrian's value, attributing stability to his insight, yet unaware of the moral calculus. The families he restored remained unaware of the architect who had intervened in their lives, and Victor's awareness grew, subtle at first, then undeniable. He began to see the invisible patterns, the dependencies he could not trace, the loyalty directed elsewhere, and he realized fully that his son, whom he had raised to admire him, had perfected the lesson he had never been taught himself. Power without conscience is fragile. Cruelty without foresight is temporary, and ambition without accountability leads inevitably to impotence. Adrian allowed Victor this realization, slowly, carefully, because the understanding itself is the punishment, the bitter clarity that comes when someone finally comprehends their own vulnerability. And, as Victor's confidence eroded further, he attempted a final measure, calling an emergency strategy session, pushing for aggressive acquisition, restructuring key holdings, hoping to reclaim authority. But Adrian had anticipated every scenario, structured contracts, subsidiaries, and regulatory approvals to absorb every movement, ensuring that Victor's signature only reinforced dependency. Operational control remained firmly in Adrian's hands, the irony complete, the empire thriving under his guidance, yet Victor powerless, forced to witness the consequences of choices made without moral consideration. And in this apex of silent mastery, Adrian walked through restored offices, visiting families who had been erased from balance sheets, seeing their lives rebuilt quietly, knowing that the true measure of revenge is not destruction, but restoration, not humiliation, but comprehension, not visibility, but permanence. The lessons embedded in every contract, every transfer, every subtle adjustment, teaching Victor the cost of ambition pursued without regard for human life. The empire itself became a living testament to Adrian's strategy, a monument to patient, invisible correction, while Victor, alive, aware, and powerless, embodied the moral outcome, a man forced to watch the consequences of his own cruelty, yet unable to reverse it, unable to assert control, forced to reckon with the architecture of justice designed meticulously by the one he had underestimated. The son he had assumed would follow faithfully, the system perfect, balanced, irrevocable. And as the city lights outside reflected off the glass towers of Vale Holdings, Adrian reflected on the paradox of revenge, understanding fully that patience, subtlety, precision, and moral clarity are far more powerful than public scandal, litigation, or violence. The empire thrived, victims restored, authority invisible, and Victor Vale remained, witnessing, comprehending, and learning that power wielded without conscience is fragile, and the most profound revenge is not immediate, not explosive, but deliberate, restorative. and invisible, leaving the guilty alive to witness the consequences of their choices. And in this quiet mastery, Adrian achieved the balance he had sought for years, a perfect equilibrium of moral authority, strategic control, and patient retribution, ensuring that the lessons of cruelty, ambition, and disregard for human life would resonate indefinitely, not as punishment through public shame, but through the enduring realization that every unethical action, every life disregarded, every moment of unearned confidence carries consequences that cannot be escaped, only observed, internalized, and felt deeply. And in this realization, the story of Adrian Vale's quiet conquest reaches the zenith of its design, a narrative of precision, patience, and moral clarity, showing that true power lies not in domination alone, but in the invisible orchestration of justice, the restoration of what has been destroyed, and the unshakable knowledge that the guilty must live to comprehend their own impotence, a lesson delivered not with spectacle, but with the silent, enduring weight of consequence. The moment of final reckoning arrived, not with a crash, not with a public scandal, but quietly, deliberately, like a storm that moves unseen beneath calm waters. For Adrian had spent years constructing a system so intricate, so perfectly balanced, that Victor Vale could no longer influence it, and yet remain unaware that his authority had been permanently diminished. It began on a seemingly ordinary morning, the city lights reflecting off the glass towers of Vale Holdings, investors reviewing quarterly reports, employees moving through their routines, and Victor, as always, seated at the head of the table, scanning documents with a confidence that had been drilled into him over decades, unaware that every line, every signature, every subsidiary he believed under his control had already been aligned to Adrian's design. Adrian approached the office with calm precision, the weight of years of patient planning behind every step. Knowing that the culmination of his work was near, the first subtle shift occurred when Victor received a note from the board requesting confirmation on a series of operational changes. Changes that on paper appeared routine but had been structured months earlier to shift full functional control to entities Adrian controlled. Victor reviewed the documents, his eyes scanning familiar names, familiar subsidiaries, and for the first time felt a hesitation, a whisper of doubt. He called Adrian over, asking for clarification, and Adrian provided a calm, measured walkthrough, detailing the rationale, emphasizing stability, continuity, and the necessity of delegation to manage market volatility. Victor nodded, satisfied superficially. Yet deep down he sensed that authority was slipping. The tremor in his hand betrayed his confidence. The next wave came when key financial decisions, previously assumed to be his prerogative, were automatically routed through Adrian's systems, regulatory approvals, compliance verifications, operational adjustments all orchestrated to ensure the empire continued seamlessly without Victor's intervention. The irony was exquisite. The man who had built an empire on obedience now found his authority irrelevant, his power an illusion. As Adrian watched from the periphery, noting the subtle physical manifestations of Victor's dawning realization, the tightening of his jaw, the slight furrow in his brow, the hesitation before signing papers that previously required no thought, and Adrian knew the final lesson was ready to be delivered. It required one precise move, one decision that would leave Victor fully aware of the consequences of a lifetime of ambition pursued without conscience. Adrian prepared the final documents, a strategic merger of several critical subsidiaries. On the surface, an essential business decision. Beneath the surface, a complete transfer of operational control into trusts and entities designed to be invisible to Victor, legally binding, fully compliant, and irreversible without complex intervention. Victor reviewed the merger, confident that his signature would direct the empire as he always had. Adrian provided detailed projections, risk assessments, and strategic justifications, all aligned to the appearance of support, while in reality the decision completed the transition Adrian had been orchestrating for years. Victor signed, confident, oblivious, and in that moment Adrian's patience, planning, and precision bore fruit. Every operational thread, every contract, every financial channel now routed through Adrian's control, the empire functioning flawlessly, yet Victor powerless. And as Victor leaned back, the realization began to form, subtle at first, then undeniable, that his control had slipped away entirely. He called Adrian into his office, voice restrained, not angry but tense, asking how such a seamless transition of power could occur without his knowledge. Adrian answered honestly yet carefully, framing every change as strategic, necessary, and compliant, reinforcing the lesson that leadership demands trust in advisors, yet leaving the truth invisible. Victor's eyes widened as comprehension dawned slowly. The empire he had believed indestructible now operated independently, guided by the very son he had raised to admire him. And in this moment, Victor understood the paradox of power. that ambition without conscience is fragile, that cruelty without foresight carries consequences, that unchecked authority eventually leads to impotence. Adrian allowed the realization to settle, watching as the weight of comprehension manifested physically. The once confident Titan, now tense, weary, aware of vulnerability he had never known, yet still alive, forced to confront the architecture of justice he could neither manipulate nor control. Over the following days, Victor attempted small measures, reviews, adjustments, attempts to assert influence, but every move reinforced dependency. Operational control remained with Adrian's structures, decisions routed through him, financial outcomes preemptively stabilized, and each time Victor acted, he strengthened the very system he sought to control. Silently, invisibly, permanently, and Adrian continued his moral restoration efforts, rebuilding the lives of those previously erased, reinforcing pensions, stabilizing families, restoring dignity to those previously considered acceptable losses. All without recognition, all without fanfare. And the contrast between Victor's impotence and Adrian's influence became undeniable. Employees now looked to Adrian first. The board instinctively consulted him. The financial channels moved in harmony under his unseen hand, and Victor, powerless to intervene, witnessed the consequences of a lifetime of unexamined ambition, every unethical choice returning as a lesson he could neither ignore nor reverse. The city outside moved on, unaware of the silent orchestration within the Vale Empire. The company thrived, stability maintained. Headlines praised the legacy without ever hinting at the invisible corrections, and Victor, forced to confront the limits of his control, experienced the ultimate punishment, comprehension without recourse. And in the quiet evenings, Adrian walked past restored offices, seeing families he had silently helped, employees thriving under restored stability, knowing that the true power of revenge is not in destruction but in restoration, in the subtle, invisible reshaping of influence, in the permanent shift of authority, while the guilty remain alive to witness it. Finally, Adrian met Victor in the office one last time, not to gloat, not to accuse, but to allow the lesson to crystallize fully. Victor asked a question, voice low, careful, almost resigned, asking when control had truly shifted. Adrian answered directly, calmly, precisely, explaining that control slipped the moment the system no longer required blind obedience, the moment accountability replaced fear, and Victor nodded, comprehension settling over him like a slow tide, the weight of years of ambition pursued without conscience pressing heavily, and Adrian knew the lesson was complete. The empire now balanced, victims restored, authority invisible, revenge achieved with precision, morality reinforced, and Victor Vale remained, alive, aware, powerless, a living testament to the consequence of unexamined ambition, cruelty, and disregard for human life, while Adrian Vale, silent architect, stood ready to guide the empire responsibly, understanding fully the weight and responsibility of true power, the paradox of patience and subtlety, of morality and strategy, a narrative that would endure, a lesson embedded invisibly in contracts, subsidiaries, employees, and lives restored, teaching Victor and all who witnessed quietly that power without conscience is temporary. Authority misused carries consequences, and the most profound revenge is invisible, restorative, enduring, leaving the guilty alive to comprehend their own impotence. And as Adrian walked through the glass towers that reflected the city lights like distant stars, he reflected on the journey, knowing the ultimate lesson had been delivered, not with spectacle, not with confrontation, but through patient orchestration, moral clarity, and invisible dominance, a perfect equilibrium of justice and power, teaching that every choice carries weight, every action consequence, and every empire is only as enduring as the conscience that guides it. And in this final understanding, Adrian's work reached completion. The Vale Empire thriving under corrected, moral, and invisible guidance, Victor fully aware of the consequences of ambition pursued without conscience, powerless to undo what had been silently and perfectly orchestrated, and the story closed on the perfect balance of justice, patience, and invisible authority. A tale of revenge that required no spectacle, only the enduring, quiet understanding of the power of foresight, morality, and calculated precision. And if you found this story compelling, do not forget to like, subscribe, and comment where you are watching this from and what time it is there, because every story becomes more powerful when shared and discussed.